Hi you guys, and welcome back to another true crime and makeup time video. If you're new here, my name is Zara and I post a new true crime video every single week. So if you love makeup, you love true crime, definitely hit that subscribe button. It would mean so much to me, guys, and I would also love it if you could leave some cool case suggestions down below. So today's case, you guys, is honestly no words. It's so messed up. And I think I actually came across it on like an article on Facebook, and when I read the title, I had to click on it. To think that someone's own parents would neglect them to the point that this case takes it to, like the extremity of it all, it's disgusting and difficult to even imagine, let alone to witness. And I believe the authorities in this case have claimed to struggle a lot since the discovery of Lacey Fletcher. So let's get into today's case. So this case takes place in the town of Slaughter, and Slaughter is a small town in Louisiana close to Baton Rouge in the United States, obviously. And I think in the 2010 census, it had like 950 people living there. And in the 2000 census, there was like 1,000 people living there, like just over 1,000. But then in the 2020 census, there was like less than 900 people living there, like 880 or something like that. So it seems like people are not really flocking to that town to live there. The name alone is like creepy. Sorry to anyone that lives there. It's just a creepy name to like name a town, Slaughter. And this town was really small. I mean, it was so small that everyone knew each other. I mean, you would be running into the same people all the time at the grocery store, at the post office. Like, you'd probably see them all the time. And while I think that's kind of cool, you don't really, like, not many people would be strangers in the town to you, But it probably also means that everyone would know your business. You know what I mean? Like, if you went to the grocery store, like, everyone would like know what's in your cart. If you're trying to get like a pregnancy test or something, like you probably can't hide that, So this case is based on, well, it's about Lacey Fletcher. So let's talk about who Lacey was. Lacey Fletcher was a 36-year-old woman, and she lived with her two parents, Sheila and Clay, and they were both 64 and 65 years old, respectively. Her father, Clay, is reportedly an officer at the Baton Rouge Civil War Roundtable, which is like a nonprofit that tries to make aware about the sacrifices the officers made at the Civil War. And her mother, Sheila, was a police and court clerk, an assistant to the prosecutor in another town, like a nearby town, and a town alderman, but she resigned that post in February of this year, 2022. The family moved to a new home when Lacey was around 9 years old, and she made friends with the kids, in the same road, and she would play with them, and she sort of didn't have any struggles in that aspect. She went to Brownsville Baptist Academy, and people at the school described her as a super smart and sweet and welcoming girl. She also played volleyball and was a part of the school team. And her family and her were a church-going family, and they were pretty religious. Her parents were actually church leaders in the community, and they regularly attended a Baptist church in the nearby town of Zachary. Lacey was reportedly diagnosed with Asperger syndrome, and what actually distinguishes Asperger syndrome from like classic autism is that its symptoms are a little bit less severe, and it doesn't really come with like language delays and things like that. Children with Asperger syndrome may only, this is again just general, may only mildly be affected with certain symptoms, but they generally display good language and cognitive skills. They say that to the untrained eye, a child with Asperger syndrome may appear as just a neurotypical child, just behaving a bit different. I'm not exactly sure when she was diagnosed or if it was an official diagnosis, but it seemed to be around the age of 14 to 15 years old. And that was in the 9th grade when she began homeschooling. And the reason Lacey began homeschooling is because she, around this age, 14, 15, she started to develop like severe social anxiety. Neighbors in the area stated that when Lacey began to be homeschooled, that's when they noticed a shift in her and her behavior. They said that she wasn't the same as before when she was growing up, and she wasn't as mature as all the other like neighborhood kids around her. A neighbor named Robert Blades, who moved to the area like 4 years before the Fletchers did, he had a wife and kids, well, sons around Lacey's age. And he said that Lacey appeared to be a fun girl. She liked to do fun things. And he states that he never sort of suspected anything, quote unquote, wrong with Lacey until she was a teenager. He said that's when he saw a shift in her, and she went from like hanging out with all the kids to just being sort of by herself. None of her friends wanted to hang out with her anymore. And one of his sons actually mentioned that she just became different. She just didn't see things the way a lot of other kids saw them. She differed in her interests from a lot of the other kids her age. And she was not your typical, teenager. He does say, though, that she was really smart. He said she was smart as hell. His son said that the best way to sort of put it was that Lacey just wasn't as mature as them, as they were growing up. And she still liked children things while they moved on to liking more teenage things. His son goes on to state that, when they were like 17, 18 years old, Lacey was still into like Disney music, movies, and country music. And, he was moving on to like motorcycles and things like that. However, Lacey's friends from grade school want to make it known that she wasn't someone who just always stayed to herself. She did have friends. She had a life. She played sports, and she was, normal. One friend in particular states that she remembers Lacey would always email her like music videos and, Disney like film clips and things like that. And she loved the Disney rides at theme parks. She loved country music, and she loved just music in general. She talked about it all the time, and she would always send them emails, at Disney World and showing them things that she liked. And that was like her passion. And they said they have emails from her up until it was the year 2014. Another friend says that they went to like a really small and private school, and that she actually went to school with Lacey from kindergarten up until the 9th grade. And she said Lacey was definitely verbal and mobile during all those years. She never had any difficulties or showed any signs of difficulties at that time. And while she did have some learning difficulties, which they later diagnosed as being Asperger syndrome, she, had friends. She played on the volleyball team. She was in the bowling league. She had slumber parties. She loved going to Disneyland. And most of all, she loved music. They keep mentioning how much she loved music, especially country music and Mariah Carey. They also said she had an amazing memory and she could recite many, many facts. Then suddenly, out of nowhere, Lacey she vanished. The last person who claims to have seen Lacey in person is that same neighbor, Robert, who says the last time he saw her was in the street, and she was just carrying like small weights with her. And he believes she would have been around 21 years old at the time. And that was back in 2007. He says that when he saw her that time, she appeared to be fairly normal physically, and she had always been thin. So when he saw her, she was thin, and he just didn't think anything of it. And obviously at the time she was exercising, like carrying around small weights. And he'd seen her a few times doing that, just exercising in the road. And he didn't say anything to her at that time when he saw her in 2007, because he just didn't feel like he needed to. But then years passed. No one had seen Lacey. And then that same neighbor, like at least he used to see her on the road, like exercising, things like that. From seeing her every once in a while to not seeing her for years, he ended up questioning her father, Clay, one time when he saw him in his front yard. And I mean, the weird thing to me is, and unfortunately, he only questioned her father like 5 years ago. So that would have been 2017. So he hadn't seen Lacey for nearly or maybe 10 years at that point. Like, I can see how that can happen because you're so sort of involved and enthralled in your own life that you don't, realize. But I mean, your neighbor, like that's a long time to not see someone, And I mean, the last time he saw her was when she was 21. So at this point, 10 years later, she would be a grown ass woman at 31 years old, So it's kind of insane. So Robert, when he sees Clay, he says, how's Lacey? What's been going on? Where's she been? Robert actually believed that Lacey had gotten married and just moved on by that point. Or maybe, went to college or something like that. He just didn't think, again, much of it. And he says that this theory sort of made sense to him because a lot of people in that town don't really stay very long in the town of Slaughter. So he just believed she also just moved on. So he said, how's Lacey? How's she doing? Has she moved on? Has she gone to college? Has she got married? Like, what's she been up to? And Clay replied, oh no, she's still here. She still lives here. She's fine. And then he just moved on. And he completely changed the subject, and that was it. He hadn't explained anything. He didn't say anything. And he didn't explain why no one had seen Lacey out of the house in 10 years. And Robert said that's her father. So he just took his word for it, and he didn't question anything because there had been no reason to. There was no alerts or anything like that, or no suspicious sort of behavior. He kind of just was like, okay. It wouldn't be until this year, 2022, until Lacey would be seen again, but unfortunately she wouldn't be found alive. On January 3rd, 2022, Lacey would be found dead on her parents' couch. Lacey had been covered in feces, found emaciated. Her body at this point had reportedly melted into the sofa. Lacey was completely buried and sunken in this weird hole in the couch. And it was a deep, big hole. It wasn't just like a hole this big. It was a hole like this big. Her right arm was draped over the top of her near skeletal body, near her neck. And she was found leaning over on her left side. And she was found, this is what I find weird, she was found only wearing a t-shirt, which is just so weird. She was just wearing a t-shirt, but the t-shirt had been pulled up over her chest and her breasts were just exposed. And it's just, I just don't understand that. Her eyes were open and her gaze was staring at something. Her mouth was open and her teeth were exposed. Her legs were pulled up and crossed beneath her. Almost in a way, when you cross your legs to get comfortable, but her position was almost like a form of survival. And how did this happen? How did a child, well, she wasn't a child, she was a woman at this point, but someone's child, living in the home with two parents, two grown adults too, who were capable. I mean, her parents didn't seem like they had anything wrong with them. They were healthy, they were fit. How did this happen? And before we delve deeper into how Lacey was found and things like that, I feel like I have to mention there was a claim that Lacey had been suffering or suffered from a condition called locked-in syndrome. And this syndrome allegedly, didn't give her control of her own muscles, and her two parents, Sheila and Clay, were her primary caregivers due to this, or, they were supposed to be. But you'll see why there's a claim that maybe she didn't suffer from this later on. But what is locked-in syndrome? It basically is a neurological condition where all your muscles are paralyzed apart from your eye. You can still move your eyes around. And people who have locked-in syndrome, they're conscious and they're awake, but they have no ability to produce any movement. They also apparently cannot speak, but their brain function remains unaffected. And the way that they communicate, if possible, is through eye movement and blinking. And locked-in syndrome usually happens because there's a damage to one of the parts in the brain, which shuts down all voluntary movement. And according to this, if she did suffer from this, Lacey had no choice. She was basically a prisoner in her own body, her own mind. Even if her mind function, remained the same, imagine wanting to move, wanting to, do certain things, and you can't. You have to rely on someone else for all of this. She had to rely solely on her parents to take care of her completely, to help her live, to feed her, bathe her, look after her medical needs. And even if she didn't suffer from this syndrome, if she suffered from, the severe anxiety, she clearly suffered in some way, some type of medical needs, and she needed the help. Whatever condition she was suffering from was clearly debilitating, and her parents were supposed to be her caregivers. But Lacey had not been to a doctor or seen a doctor in 20 years. Her parents claimed the reason for this and why she hadn't is simply because Lacey didn't want to go. So I'm going to talk about how Lacey was found, and it's pretty distressing, especially if you have, if you know someone with special needs. So it's sad to know that this is how Lacey was found. But her face was like blotched with like deep red spots. She was covered, like I mentioned before, in feces. Her hair was knotted, and apparently, I don't know what this really means, but they said it even got into her ears. So what does that mean? Like it was growing from her ears, or hair was in her ears? I don't really know, but that's what they said. She was on this brown leather couch next to a wall, and apparently there was like only an 18-inch gap between the wall and the couch. And then weirdly enough, even though how she was found, next to the couch, there was like this nice gray toilet and like a pile of like neatly folded fresh laundry. There was a black like coffee table in front of her, and it had lotion bottles, talcum powder, nose spray, wipes, like this like medicine box, and other sort of like objects, that you would need to care for a child or something like that. So, like baby wipes and stuff like that. So clearly they had the stuff in front of them that they needed to at least keep Lacey hygienic. And there were DVD boxes found, neatly kept on that table. And a lot of them were actually children's movies. Like I mentioned, Lacey liked Disney movies. So a lot of these were actually those types of movies. And I mean, the full extent of Lacey's injuries were only really revealed when an autopsy was conducted by the coroner and, a forensic examination conducted. And it was, from what they say, it was just traumatic what she went through. When she was discovered, she only weighed 96 pounds. I think that's like 40 something kilos. It's really nothing. The skin on her bottom had like worn away or eaten away over the 12 years that she spent on that couch. And the report said a lot of her skin had vanished because there were big raw red spots. And I think those essentially are bed sores. So when people become bedridden, they always like turn them or move them periodically. I think it's every few hours. So how long had Lacey been in the same position if she couldn't move her muscles, or if she couldn't mentally do it or something, whatever her condition was? How long has she had to be in that same position for her to develop these injuries? The grossest thing to me is that she was partially like buried in this couch, right? But not only was she buried, she was completely covered in urine, feces, bug bites, maggots, flies. Lacey also had like feces smeared on her face, her breasts, her buttocks, her back. Her back and her bottom were so blackened from laying sort of, I guess, in that position for so long that you wouldn't even be able to recognize what it was if you looked at it and didn't know the context. And there were live bugs and like rodents nearby on the couch in that room, I guess. But the rest of the house, weirdly, was like neat and tidy and clean. That's what I don't get. Like, I don't understand how you even have that in your home and you know that that's where your daughter is living or staying. I don't understand that. So how did Lacey actually die? So this is what the report stated that she died from. So she died from severe medical negligence, which resulted in chronic malnutrition, acute hunger, immobility, acute ulcer development, osteomyelitis, which is like a bone infection, and then eventually sepsis. Lacey was also, infected with COVID at the time, and she suffered from severe anxiety and her Asperger syndrome. Lacey was 36 years old, and she hadn't seen, or there wasn't sort of like any records of her visiting a doctor since she was 16 years old. That's 20 years. 20 years without seeing a doctor when you have a medical condition. Now, remember before I said she suffered from locked-in syndrome? Now, the coroner kind of like, I wouldn't say he disputes it, but he does dispute it. He does. He states basically that there's a misconception regarding Lacey's illnesses and what she actually suffered from. In terms of Lacey suffering from, locked-in syndrome, the coroner states that he doesn't know where that term came from or what it even is. Because he states that in his years as a medical physician, years and years, decades, he had never even heard of that term. He says the only diagnosis that he knows that Lacey suffered from was Asperger syndrome and social anxiety. He said those are the only 2 diagnoses that she's ever had, and that the last time on record she's seen a physician was when she was 16 years old. So he disputes the locked in syndrome term. But what I find weird about that, how's he never heard of that term? Like, if you literally just Google it, there's like so many definitions and cases and things like that. So that's something I find kind of weird. I don't know if he's just saying that Lacey didn't suffer from it, or if he's kind of saying that that's not even a term, like it doesn't exist. That syndrome doesn't exist, you know? Lacey's friends from grade school say that when they first heard of the news that Lacey had been found, not only been found in that situation, but the fact that she even died was a huge shock to them. They state that over the years they did have their, not suspicions, but they believed something was kind of strange, because they would see her parents on Facebook, so Sheila and Clay's Facebook, and they would see on the Facebook that Sheila and Clay were always out and about. They were at dinners, they were at LSU sporting events, they were at family gatherings, and Lacey was never in any single one of those photos. They said that Sheila never even mentioned Lacey, or Clay never even mentioned Lacey on their Facebook. These same friends stated that one time they went back and looked at her Facebook page, and they realized that Sheila had not posted a single photo of Lacey since 2011. I mean, who goes over a decade without posting a picture of their children? Like, I feel like ever since I had a child, I post him more than I even post myself. And if you're at these gatherings all the time and events, and your child, suffers from social anxiety, do you just leave her alone at home? She didn't have a carer. Clearly she was neglected, right? Their friends said that something always seemed off with Lacey's family, but obviously they never imagined something like this ever happening. For me, there's so much anger, because I'm like, how can this be overlooked? How was this missed? How can her parents go out and be social and enjoy their time out while their daughter is just at home there in a neglected state with no one to look out for her? I understand she was a grown woman, so in their eyes, they're like, she's grown, she's like a grown-ass woman, but she was a grown woman who deteriorated due to a medical condition where it was impossible for her to take care of herself even slightly. And even if she could take care of herself, say she didn't have locked-in syndrome, but mentally she wasn't able to, mentally she refused to, mentally she, couldn't bring herself to do it, even if she was physically able to, that's still a condition. That's still someone who needed help. And I think what makes it worse for me is that Lacey had a normal childhood. She was self-sufficient at one time, had likes, interests, hobbies, and had fun. Then her condition worsened, whether it was locked-in syndrome or social anxiety, whatever it was, it caused her to, not be the same. So for me as a parent, to watch your child, even if you just have the one child, you watch them grow up, you watch them play, you watch them laugh and smile and be silly, watch movies, react to things, read books, socialize, all those kinds of things. And then to suddenly not be able to do those things, or to suddenly just stop doing those things. As a parent, wouldn't you just grow super concerned? Wouldn't you seek help constantly? Especially if you're living in a small community. I mean, you would seek help from someone, or just take her to a freaking doctor. Why wasn't she at a doctor? I mean, my son would literally be like, ow, my knees hurt. And I'm booking a doctor's appointment. I'm like, his knees hurt. Why is his knees hurting? You know what I mean? Your daughter literally cannot advocate, or would not advocate for herself, cannot or would not, either way. And you don't go and seek medical help, even advice, within a certain period of time. Maybe not right away. Maybe they were in denial about certain things, but it's been years. There's no excuse. For me, it's mind-blowing that you wouldn't do everything you could in your power to help your child or receive proper treatment for your child. It blows my mind. Her parents literally just let her sit on that couch. She peed and used the bathroom on that couch. They claimed that she actually was able to communicate with them and that she never complained about anything. Just because she didn't complain about sitting in her own feces and urine and bugs and maggots, or even if it wasn't at that level at one point, how did the hole in the couch form? How did it form? When it became a little asshole, you should have got her ass off that couch and put her in a bed, moved her around the area. Like, just because she didn't complain doesn't mean she wasn't miserable. I mean, if you're like me, you're probably thinking, well, where are their friends and family? One friend, where are they? When this came out in the media, a lot of their friends claimed that they didn't even know that Sheila and Clay even had a child, which blows my mind, and it doesn't make any sense at all, especially it being a small town and people talking, and come on, that doesn't make sense. And if they neglected her so bad, I was even questioning, like, why even call the police when they found her dead? Like, clearly they didn't care about her to a certain extent. But her body was discovered after her mother, Sheila, she rang 911 at 2 a.m. on January 3rd when she believed that her daughter had stopped breathing. The coroner was immediately called to the scene after the initial deputy who came to investigate it was like horrified and shocked. However, it's possible that Sheila may have actually been forced to make that call. Apparently, there was one neighbor who visited the home that day, and we don't know who this neighbor was, but they had been to the home and they had reportedly seen Lacey in that state, and they were the ones who told Sheila, like, you better get her some help. So who knows if that is true? Who knows how long Lacey would have been actually left like that? You know, maybe they wouldn't have even reported her dead. When the police arrived to investigate the call, the parents were just standing in the kitchen and they didn't even have an explanation as to what the hell they were looking at. I mean, there's a child. I mean, she's a grown woman, but their child is like melted into the couch, covered in things that a human being should never be sitting in. The police described that when they opened the door, the stench was so bad that it would like run a person out of the home. And how do the parents live with that stench? Like, apparently the rest of the house was nice and clean. The smell alone, were they just used to it? The coroner was then called, and then they ruled Lacey's death a homicide due to severe neglect. He recorded her official death at 3:07 a.m. on the 3rd of January, but he believes that Lacey may have been dead for 24 to 48 hours prior to that. The same coroner states that he couldn't eat any food for an entire week, and he cried for weeks. Sheila and Clay were then arrested. On May 2nd of this year, a grand jury indicted Sheila and Clay for second-degree murder in the death of their daughter, Lacey Fletcher. They turned themselves in and they were booked into the jail that same day, and their bonds were set at $300,000 each. Just a day later, on May 3rd, Sheila was seen coming out of the jail after posting that $300,000 bond, while Clay didn't come out till, 2 days later, May 4th. And their lawyer put out a statement saying they don't want to relive the pain of losing their child through the media. He states that they have been through a lot of heartaches over the years, and anyone who has lost a child would know what they're going through. After Lacey's death, the parents tell investigators that after she dropped out of high school and was beginning to be homeschooled at the age of 14, 15 after the 9th grade, it was Lacey's choice to never leave the couch, and that she opted to use the toilet on that couch instead of going to the actual toilet or using a bowl or something like that. Sheila claims that she cleaned Lacey regularly, she tended to her wounds, and she took care of her bed sores, and that Lacey never complained about them. How did Lacey never complain about something that was probably so painful? Her flesh was literally rotting away. If convicted, Sheila and Clay will face life in prison without parole. I mean, there's not much information, on this case. It was just like a report that was made of this woman being found, and I find it so hard that people can even treat people like that. I mean, we always think about or talk about children and babies being in danger and stuff like that, but how often do we talk about disabled people or the elderly being in danger? There are a lot of people out there who are born with or live with disabilities. Sometimes their carers are not equipped with, or even mentally equipped with, the tools to care for someone, whether it's a loved one or if it's even their job to care for someone with needs, special needs. But think about the disabled or the elderly. They don't have the means or even the voice sometimes to advocate for their rights, which obviously then leads to the risk of them being taken advantage of much higher. The risk is much, much greater. How many times have you seen in the news that elderly people get taken advantage of financially, even, like their maids or something like that. Like, they take advantage of them and take all their money or something like that because they just don't have someone looking out for them. I mean, I just read of another case recently where when I read the title, I read it as father, locks son in room for decades or something. And I was like, wait, what? And I read it again. It was the son. It was like a 20-year-old son or 30-year-old son who locked his elderly father in a room in the house and would just left him there to rot for years. He wouldn't feed him. He wouldn't take care of him. And the poor father, even though he was being treated that way, he didn't want his son, I think, to get in trouble. And he still loved his son so much. And that's the sad thing. It just breaks my heart. I'm not saying all elderly people or disabled people, obviously. I'm just saying the people that don't have, someone looking out for them. Okay, I'm rambling. This case was extremely sad and Lacey did not deserve any of that. And I'm sure there would have been people in that town who were willing to help Lacey, or even an institution where she could have gone to receive help. There would have been someone who, supported her needs. Oh, it's really sad. Let me know your thoughts down below, guys. I hope you found today's video interesting and I will see you in the next one. Besitos. Bye.